So, one of the most important things I think that we talk about in this class is coaching. Our sole goal is to make sure that our staff have the highest work performance, and our clinical team in particular has good treatment fidelity, so that we can maximize the outcomes for our clients. And of course, the same coaching and feedback that I talk about with your clinical staff will be the same as they are for your more administrative staff. The way we find the most out about coaching and feedback is to look at an area called implementation science. In implementation science, there was a recognition that simply having research out there that showed you that a treatment was effective wasn't enough. What you really needed to do was to recognize that, even knowing what that literature is, reading about that literature alone wasn't enough. Formal training alone would not be enough to work. And somebody providing a dictate from on high, someone in management saying that, oh, we're going to do this because I say we're going to do this, that doesn't work. And frankly, even financial incentives alone do not work. And part of that is because much of the work we do, as you have already learned in your other classes, can be very complex, and to implement it accurately with it being customized, individualized, based on contextual variables for your clients can be a challenging thing, even for your hardest working, most capable staff. And so there was a recognition that we needed to start looking at in the literature this implementation science. How do we make sure that clients are being exposed to treatments that are most effective? And one thing we know for sure, and which you've learned through your other classes, is that clients aren't really going to be exposed to efficacious treatments if they're not implemented with fidelity. So, what do we need to know about that? Well, let's take one step back first. The first thing as you already know, is that before you begin implementing any intervention, you go through a process of deciding which treatment should select. And the place to begin, of course, is to look at which treatments have been shown to be effective in the literature. You should always begin by selecting these, but of course, there are times where the best literature is for a different population, but it's the same problem. Or you've got good literature about something, a treatment being effective for a lot of people, but you don't know in this particular setting that it's been applied before. And so you begin by looking at what treatments have been shown to be effective, trying to get as specific as possible to the setting and the population, and that's where you begin selecting your treatments. But you, as the supervisor, also need to consider how do I train my staff to make sure that they're selecting treatments that have been shown to be effective. The next step I have to think about once I've identified what treatments need to be implemented is, okay, whose capacity needs to be implemented? As a supervisor, it often does not involve training just one person. It often involves training a team of people or training a smaller number of people who go out and train a larger number of people. And so I need to decide who exactly do I need to begin the capacity building process with, and who are all of the people whose capacity needs to be developed over time. And I need to think not just who, but what systems are affected. For example, I've done systems level intervention that involve training transportation specialists because trips to a community setting were impossible for an older individual, or getting home from school was impossible for a child on the bus in the current conditions. So developing an intervention had to involve more than just training the teacher on how to get the kiddo on the bus, or training the staff how to get somebody to buckle their safety belt. We had to work on more capacity building than that. And even though we do formal training, we know that that's insufficient, and so coaching is our best method for truly building capacity. So we want to not only do formal training, as we've talked about before, which should also include role playing, but you should then move it into the natural setting, and where you're modeling it for the person, where you are allowing them to do it and giving them feedback. And so this is the coaching process. So let's start by talking about what is coaching. Let's start by defining it. Coaching involves the active and intentional process of supporting another person as they develop critical skills. And so, you think about that in very broad terms. So if I'm coaching a little league softball, if if I'm coaching a football team, if I'm coaching my staff, it's all the same. I have to be active and I have to be thinking through the process of how do I support somebody else as they acquire the skills that are needed to perform at the level that's needed. Sometimes coaching involves bringing in external consultants or having internal consultants. The truth is that there is no perfect solution. External consultants, sometimes you can bring in experts from the outside that have skills that aren't available within an organization, and that can be extremely beneficial. On the other hand, if you have expertise within your system, it's cost effective, time efficient, and can serve as a great opportunity for people who are internal to the organization. As a supervisor, you have to not just train people, but remember that you have to coach them too. That could be anything from completing their work in a timely manner. I can't tell you how many organizations I've worked in where people didn't get their reports done on time, and if you don't get your reports done and submitted on time, there's a chance that the organization won't get paid. Now, you may think, well, what does that have to do with providing client services? Well, if you don't get paid for the services you're providing, you won't be providing services very long because your organization is going to shut down. It just won't be fiscally sound. It also obviously means coaching people on how to implement treatments with fidelity, how to work with anybody at any organizational level to work more effectively in their role toward organizational goals. As a supervisor, you may also, like I said, need to bring somebody in from the outside your organization to serve as a coach. I would say this. People often think that bringing in an external coach involves bringing them in on a one-time basis. Coaching is an ongoing process where you're assessing, not only are you teaching the skill in a natural context, modeling it, allowing the person to demonstrate the skill with your feedback, allowing them to do it independently to fidelity, but you often need them to come back, that external coach to come back, or consultant to come back, because the parameters have changed. This client is moving to a different setting. There are other people working with him or her. And so when you consider an external consultant, it can be a great idea, but you need to think it through all the way. What are some requirements for good coaching? First of all, you have to have credibility and experience. Bringing in someone who, I can't tell you how often people will tell me, I just don't believe this person. They just got their BCBA. And the truth is, as you know, you have more experience than you did when you were taking your intro to ABA class. You've worked with a lot more clients now, and you can see that having that experience can make a difference. And so you have to be a credible source. Often that involves you having the expertise yourself. And so not only that you know how to tell people how to do something, but you know how to do it yourself. Another issue for coaching is that you have to be available. As a supervisor, it's critical that you're available on site, that you're available in real time, that you're repeatedly providing coaching, that it's not just seen as this follow-up process to a formal training that you're doing, that you're willing to provide the coaching and the supervision that's at the level of intensity that's required to help someone develop the skill and to sustain the skill. Again, there are lots of skills that we develop. I can't tell you from a computer, for example, how often I've called the help desk and they've talked me through something, and then I go and it's 6 months later I need to do it again, and I'm not proficient at that skill. And so often for real coaching to occur, it needs to occur on a protracted period of time or at a level of intensity to really help me acquire that skill and to be able to use it in real world settings. Another requirement for coaching is that it's viewed as a support for training. That other forms of training are important for knowledge acquisition. So, for example, the videos you watch for this class, the readings that you do, the activities we have you do, these are other forms of training. But training by itself is insufficient. Not one person is going to walk out of this sequence of courses that you're taking and be absolutely proficient at everything. You have to have the supervision and the coaching and feedback in order to do that. And the same is true when you become the supervisor. The difference is you already have a bachelor's degree in an area that's related. You may or may not have a master's degree. You might be working on it right now, and you're taking these classes for the behavior analysis certification process. And so you may have a lot more training than the people that you're going to be training. You're going to be working with a lot of direct service staff who've had really almost no training, that often come in with a limited educational background or limited training. Their training comes from working at Burger King or the mall, and certainly there's skills they acquired in those jobs that will help them in whatever activity you have for them. But training by itself is not going to be sufficient. Previous training and formal training, they have to have the coaching and feedback. So, where do we begin with coaching? Like everything else, we often begin with assessment. You, as the coach, assessing the extent to which somebody's implementing your treatment with fidelity. I also always strongly encourage people to complete a self assessment. Where do they think that they stand? What are the skills they think that they need help with the most? Because that allows you to have a good dialogue on where they're at. And it may be that they're doing something proficiently already and they're not aware of it. And this gives you an opportunity to let them know the things that they're doing well and not just the things that they need to work on. After the assessment process, what do? You work together to develop a training and coaching plan. You work toward how do I get this implemented and with fidelity, and that part of my assessment process is assessing how well is this being implemented. What are the resources that are needed? Are they available when the direct care staff needs them? So assessment at each of these phases, and then of course ongoing evaluation. So what do coaches do? Well, coaches typically begin working with a staff member to make sure that they acquire relevant knowledge. This can happen. You can watch the adult training videos. You typically want to provide this kind of knowledge acquisition in relatively short bursts. So that's why we have our videos are typically pretty short, and that they get multiple chances to review it until they get that level of knowledge. Next, the staff member should get the opportunity to watch how something is performed. So for example, let's say you and I were working on training a staff member. One of the things that we might do is have you serve as a role model, guiding me through the process so they can see what that process of coaching looks like, and you guiding me so that you're teaching me the process. And then with that staff member, then I'm going to perform. Then I want the staff member to perform and getting guidance and modeling, but I want them to be the primary performer. Then in step 2, when I'm working with a staff member, I need to make sure that once that staff member has acquired the skills, I need to make sure that they're capable of teaching others. And the reason for this is until you're capable of teaching others, you often don't have the level of fluency that's needed to really perform extremely well. I want someone so good that they can actually train someone else. This also increases a critical component related to implementation science, which is sustainability. I can't tell you across this country the number of centers and schools and programs where people have done great training. They've even done good coaching and feedback, but the system is not set up to be sustainable. You often have people leave a job, new people come in, and unless you have staff that are fluent enough that they can teach and train others by increasing their knowledge, giving them the opportunity to see a treatment implemented with fidelity, and then having them do it with input and guidance, you're less likely to have a sustainable model. I've talked about this a bit already, so I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to talk about the difference between coaching versus training, because sometimes people get it confused. Coaching involves actively collaborating with other people, participating in the process. Everyone involved in a coaching process has some skin in the game, to use a sports metaphor. Everyone is actively engaged and involved. It can begin with selection of goals. everybody should have input about the selection of goals. And yes, you as the supervisor, it's your job to teach them to focus on treatments that are efficacious and function based. But that when you look at treatment, your treatment options that have evidence of efficacy and that are function based, often that leaves you with many, many different options. And so now you can talk about what are the things that you need training in, what is the hierarchy of skills that you would need in order to implement those different interventions. You wouldn't want to target everything at once. So together you decide what are the goals that we have for training at this point. Some other things related to making sure people are actively collaborating and participating. First of all, you want to build from existing competence, and this is again where that assessment process comes into place. You want to make sure that you have assessed who has skills already that are at criterion, and for other people that haven't, what skills do they have that we can build on? Something that I've been saying for years as I've trained in multiple organizations is that everyone is in a changing criterion designed for something, and so everybody's at baseline at some point. So we're constantly trying to increase the level of competency, the fluency, the performance, and we do that the same way as we change the behavior of our clients. We do it gradually after we've collected data and we have a clear plan. I've already touched on this issue of sustainability, but the last thing you want as a supervisor is to be micromanaging people. People feel like you don't trust them if you're micromanaging them. You don't have time to do the other aspects of your job if you're micromanaging them. So, as a supervisor, yes, you have to be on site. Yes, you have to be available. Yes, you have to be doing ongoing data collection to see how are people doing. But you'll actually reduce your workload significantly if you can make the system as sustainable as possible, like I've talked about already, and reduce how much micromanaging you're doing. Another thing related to coaching that's not really true of training is the issue of accountability. You are responsible for the work your staff does. And whether that is a paraprofessional in a classroom or a home care worker in a group home, you're the one who's responsible for the work your staff does. And so just training them alone and then just setting them out to do their job when we know this is inefficient is a problem, and you are responsible for that. You should be held accountable for it, and coaching is your way to get people actively participating in a process of capacity building. So, as a supervisor, how can you be a good coach? I think one of the first keys is communication. You have to be able to provide good feedback. Your feedback should be clear and concrete, and it should be highly specific. The more specific you can be, the more people know what they're supposed to do. You also want to be directive. Don't spend all of your time telling them what not to do. Tell them what to do. And so if it's that they need to provide a higher level prompt in the hierarchy, then that's specifically what you want to tell them to do. If you want to tell them that the schedule of reinforcement isn't rich enough for this client to produce behavior change, then that's what you have to tell them. And of course, you gauge the language you use to the level of training and experience and background that they have. But it's about telling them what to do. When you're a good coach, you want to deliver feedback in a neutral tone. You don't want to sound frustrated, even if you do feel frustrated. There will be times in your career where you think, I've said this to this person 14 times already. And depending on your relationship with them, it may be somebody that it's time for them to leave the organization. But there are other times where you have a trainee where you can't sever that relationship. And so even though, yes, you're frustrated, you should start asking yourself, how can I say this more clearly and concretely? How can I be more specific? How can I be more directive? But I need to make sure I'm still using a very neutral tone when I'm doing that. I want to make sure that I'm providing feedback not just as I pull somebody aside, but in real world context as well. So while they're actually working with a client, I want to be able to provide them feedback. And I want to communicate in again, being as directive and specific, but still in a very neutral tone of voice. And the one thing you don't want to forget about is that for most of your most of your employees, most of your supervisees, positive reinforcement in the form of praise can be very powerful. This is not always the case. You can't assume this is the case, but in most cases, it's true. And so you want to make sure that you're delivering a rich schedule of reinforcement. I usually recommend giving about 5 positives for every 1 constructive piece of feedback. Of course, if that you're providing so many positives that it's stopping the process from being fluid and the supervisee is getting frustrated, that's not a good thing either. What are some other things that a good supervisor can do to be a good coach? Well, one is to be reliable. That you're there. Well, you're there when you say you're going to be there. You're going to be available when you say you're going to be available. Um, Another good thing that a coach does is to guide other people in self assessments, teaching them how to evaluate their own work, teaching them to assess their own performance. And I can tell you this, there are good data out there that show if you can teach people to assess themselves and to graph their own data so that on a daily basis they're graphing their own data in their own performance, even if they're just taking probes in that self assessment process, you're much more likely to get more improvement. And then when it time for you to interact with them, they can show you their own self assessments and the areas that they're improving in, and you can confirm that with your own assessments. Other things that a good coach has to have, you have to be knowledgeable in what you're teaching or training. They may sound like the goofiest thing in the world, but I can't tell you how many times I've been in places where people are just throwing jargon all over the place, but they don't really seem to have any real world understanding or application of the processes that they've developed. You sometimes get this from professors even who have never actually worked with clients, which is one of the reasons why we focus on getting professors who have real world experience working with clients with severe challenging behaviors and across different age groups and whatnot. You also, to be a good coach, you need to be able to look at context. So, what are the conditions here versus another setting? What are variables that are going to influence the likelihood somebody is going to benefit from training on a given day, coaching and feedback? I've had people before where I've observed them, they're working extremely hard, they're not at criterion, and I can see that they're just completely exhausted. And I tell them, you know what? I want these are the things you're doing well. I want you to keep working on those things, and I want you. I want to meet again tomorrow so we can work on this process a little bit more. But these are the things you're doing well, and keep doing those things. Why? Because when somebody is that exhausted and that frustrated, well, not frustrated, that exhausted, the likelihood that they're going to screw up goes up, and inserting yourself and giving them constructive feedback at that point may not be the best idea. So, just like you have to consider contextual variables for the client, and you need to teach your staff how to consider contextual variables for your client, which is why we've got a project on that, you need to consider context in this being a good coach process. And lastly, data analysis. Like I said, my recommendation is always to have people doing self assessments and monitoring their own performance and doing data analysis on themselves. If they do that, you can come in and do IOA so that you can assess the degree of agreement between the two of you. And this serves as a great opportunity to discuss what steps need to be taken next in the coaching feedback. Outcomes of coaching. Fidelity. If I'm working with a client, the outcome should be treatment fidelity. And treatment fidelity is comprised of making sure that I've mastered a skill, that I've been able to generalize that skill, the effects of training have spread to appropriate conditions, and that I can do this fluently. I've seen people who understand the steps, can perform all of the steps, but they're not able to do it fluently. And if you're not able to do it fluently, you're not properly providing the treatment. You may even find more challenges with people who are experienced with this. And I'll give you a great example of my own career. Early on in my training, when I first learned how to do discrete trial training, I learned how to mass trial, and I didn't know anything about varied trials at all, or interspersal trials. There's a number of terms that people use for it. And so I brought in external consultants to train us in the process. And I had some staff who were frontline staff who had never worked with kids with autism before, and they seemed to pick up this varied trials so quickly, and I was really struggling. I wasn't as fluent as other people, and so I had to work with them individually to make sure that I was fluent. And so sometimes inexperience is a problem, but sometimes experience, if you're learning to do things differently, can also be a problem for really getting the fluency you need, because you're getting interference from your previous training. Another outcome of good coaching is the context, the contextual and client variables are assessed. Are there things unique to this client, their developmental level, their knowledge, their experience in this kind of setting? Are there things unique to this context, like what is the ratio of direct care staff to clients versus another setting they might be in? We've got whole videos on contextual and client variables, and you've done some readings in that area as well. The best outcome of good coaching is that the staff are able to adapt what you've taught them to unique client and contextual conditions. Another outcome of good coaching is sustainability, as I've already said. It doesn't matter how good of a job of training you do. If it means that it's not a sustainable process, it means that 6 months, a year, 3 years from now, you could walk into the same organization, it goes right back to where it started. Unless an treatment can be implemented as you need it to be, it's not sufficient. So I want to make sure that to have a really sustainable process, I need people to be able to implement it with different clients in different settings if it's appropriate, using different kinds of stimuli. For example, in employment training, I need somebody to understand how to use one copy machine versus another, and how do I train somebody using one copy machine versus another. I use this example because I am constantly stymied by copy machines. There's different technology that's emerging all the time, and the number of things that copy machines can do. So to be really sustainable, you have to have people that know how to alter the training based on one copy machine versus another. Some time back, probably about 5 years ago, I was working with a staff member who was training someone on a copy machine, training a staff member or a client on how to use a copy machine. And they were doing this as part of an employment program. And I said, I want to see the materials and I want to be able to go through them myself so I can see if I were doing this, how I would do. And so I went through and tried to use the materials, and it didn't make any sense. And it's not just that I have problems with copy machines. It was I just could not make heads or tails of it. So I brought the job coach over and I said, I need you to explain to me, like, I see this picture and I'm supposed to press this button, but this picture isn't even on this copy machine. And it was only then that she realized that the copy machine had been changed a month earlier, and that all of the previous stimuli weren't appropriate. So we need a sustainable process. And as a coach, you need to be reminding them and teaching them to consider these kinds of variables. So, and over time is another issue related to sustainability. I need to make sure that when the next client comes in, the next setting, or the next stimuli emerges, that we need to use different materials. I need to make sure that people are taking what I've taught them, that I've coached them through, that I've given them feedback on, and they have enough mastery, generalization, and fluency that as things come up, that they're able to adapt. And the last thing I want to tell you about is some of the material I got for this presentation. In fact, a lot of it, and it's on a resource that I've always thought was extraordinary, is you can get this for free on the internet, Implementation Research, a synthesis of the literature. Dean Fixon is absolutely, in my mind, the leader in implementation science. The other people listed here also are extraordinary leaders, but Dean Fixon has been truly exceptional gift to our field. And if you're trying to figure out how to, I'm really interested in this coaching and feedback model. I'm interested in all of the aspects of implementation science. I'm interested in how do I work with large systems and what does that process look like. I strongly encourage you to read this material. If nothing else, download a copy off of the internet, look it up, Google it, download a copy of it, and then when you get out there and you're actually supervising yourself, make sure you pull this material out and take a look at it. And really, that's about all that we've got for today. So thanks.